皆さん、こんにちは。
Hello everyone.
東京のオンライントークへようこそ。
Welcome to this online talk event. Art Week Tokyo is an annual event showcasing the creativity and diversity of the Japanese contemporary art scene, making it the first destination for contemporary art in Asia and beyond. It will be held at venues across Tokyo from November to 4th to 7th. All 50 participating museums, galleries and art spaces will be linked by the Art Mobile bus service, which operates 4 routes covering different parts of the city. In advance of Art Week Tokyo's launch in November, today's talk is inspired by the Tokyo cityscapes that passengers will see from the Art Mobile buses. It is our pleasure to welcome Kenjiro Hosaka, Director of the Shiga Museum of Art, and architect Ryuji Fujimura to speak about the topic of the future of art in the city, perspectives from Tokyo's recent past, 1964 to 2021.
よろしくお願いします。
Hello, my name is Kenjiro Hosaka.
ジョンさん聞こえてますよね。
はい、よろしくお願いします。
はい。
I was appointed to my current position at the Shiga Museum of Art in January this year. But before I took up that position, I worked for about 20 years at the National Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo, located near Takebashi Bridge and the Imperial Palace. I was invited to participate in this event partly because of this background. Mr. Fujimura, please introduce yourself.
My name is Ryuji Fujimura. I currently head an architectural design office and serve as an associate professor at Tokyo University of the Arts. I'm involved in urban and community development in Tokyo, and today I'd like to make remarks from this perspective.
Art Week Tokyo initially asked us to talk about the city of Tokyo and its connection with art from the perspective of urban planning. Mr. Fujimura and I were then given this assignment. I think one of the reasons why I was assigned was a belief that I was qualified to speak about the city and art. This is because I had curated a Kengo Kuma exhibition and several other exhibitions related to architecture while at the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo. One of the distinctive features of Art Week Tokyo is its art-mobile buses that go around art museums and galleries. I was told there were 4 such bus routes, and when looking at these routes during discussion with Mr. Fujimura, I realized they went to all sorts of places. After considering these far-flung routes, we thought it best to talk about the reasons and historical background of this dispersion of art spaces over diverse areas, rather than urban planning per se. We figured that this would be more informative for our audiences, who belong to various generations, whether they are accessing this today or through the archives at a later date. So we'll begin with periods a little bit in the past, including some that may be unfamiliar to younger people. I should mention that this program will be distributed in English, so we'll bear overseas audiences in mind as well. We'll speak for about an hour while also taking account of people who are less familiar with the situation in Japan and Tokyo. People in certain generations or fields may already know what we're talking about, but we'd still like to proceed in the manner I've just described. This talk event is basically composed of 2 parts. First, we'll discuss the proposition that Tokyo doesn't actually have an urban formation strong enough to be called its center. The Imperial Palace is often said to be the center of Tokyo. On this basis, Roland Barthes also declared it was a city without a center, or a city with an empty center. But instead of simply going along with Barthes' opinion, I'd like to ask Mr. Fujimura to talk a little bit more about this subject from the perspective of urban development. We also want to touch upon the actions taken by the art scene in the context of urban development. These will be our topics in the first half. As for the second half, I'd like to note that this year, Tokyo hosted the Olympics and Paralympic Games for the second time. The first time was in 1964. Naturally, the 1964 and 2021 Summer Olympics brought enormous changes to the face of Tokyo. We wish to discuss those changes, what happened over the intervening years, and what could happen in the coming years. Before entering the discussion, we should consider the urban development in Tokyo I mentioned earlier. This development did not proceed haphazardly, but was the result of various plans prepared by various people who are almost unknown to all but experts in this area. I'd therefore like to ask Mr. Fujimura to describe this area as the starting point for our discussions. Mr. Fujimura, if you please.
So in the time frame of Tokyo's recent past, our subject today, Tokyo hosted the Olympics in 1964 and the Olympic and Paralympic Games for the second time this year. I'd like to focus on the developments in Tokyo over the intervening years and present some thoughts against the background of Tokyo's urban structure. First of all, let's briefly consider developments in Tokyo from an urban aspect. In 1961, shortly before the first Tokyo Summer Olympics, Kenzo Tange announced a plan for Tokyo 1960. In 1962, the concentration of population in Tokyo hit its peak, and congestion emerged as one of the key problems or issues in the city at the time. This congestion occurred because Tokyo had a center and people headed for it every morning. This was related to the rapid influx of population from the rest of the country and Tokyo's concentric structure. Tange prepared his plan in the belief that the problem could be solved by extending the loops of the concentric structure to the space above Tokyo Bay. He envisioned the construction of a big bridge-like steel infrastructure over Tokyo Bay. His idea was quite futuristic, but I think he proposed this half with a view to raising awareness of the problem and half as a serious plan. Thereafter, Tokyo instead saw a greater increase in development on its land areas than on its sea areas. Skyscrapers went up and development moved in the direction of constructing new districts featuring mega buildings. This is a photo of Sunshine City in the Ikebukuro district. This period also saw implementation of the Urban Renewal Act and development based on dialogue with older urbanized districts. For example, as shown in this slide, Ark Hills was also constructed like a self-contained community in 1986. As seen here, formerly local neighborhoods saw the construction of high-rise clusters, transforming them into new community complexes. Next, urban development moved in the direction of a polycentric urban structure as opposed to a monocentric one. Authorities put together plans for the construction of many new city centers in the districts of Shinjuku, Shibuya, Ikebukuro, Kinshicho, and Ueno to join the existing one in the Marunouchi Yurakucho district, the former site of Tokyo City Hall, and the Rinkai Satellite City Center built on land reclaimed from Tokyo Bay became the seventh city center. In particular, the idea behind the Rinkai Satellite City Center was to establish an international financial center for all of Asia. This idea originated with Shunichi Suzuki, who was then governor of Tokyo, and Tange, who also designed the first City Hall building. Around this time, authorities studied the question of how to relieve the congestion caused by so many people heading for Yurakucho. Tange had designed the former City Hall while paying attention to the smooth vertical movement of personnel to each floor by elevator after their horizontal commute by train. Drawing on this knowledge, Tange thought of a new urban structure for Tokyo that revolved around its transportation. After the 1964 Olympics, Tange gradually distanced himself from Tokyo's policymaking and turned his attention more to projects outside Japan, such as urban planning in Singapore and other countries. The vigorous approaches to the creation of city centers and urban development in other Asian countries gave Tange a sense of alarm about the situation in Tokyo. And so, in the mid-1980s, he suggested that Tokyo should follow their example. What Tange proposed was a plan for Tokyo 1986, a revised edition of his 1960 plan. This new plan reportedly laid the foundation for development of the Rinkai Satellite City Center. He wanted to make this into a regional and financial center for all of Asia. A decision was made to relocate the City Hall to Shinjuku, leading that district to become the center of Tokyo. Similarly, Kasumigaseki was to become the center of Japan and the Rinkai Satellite City Center the center of Asia. This slide shows a conceptual drawing of the center. The development was originally supposed to be executed over a 30-year period, but Tange feared that Tokyo would lose out to Singapore, Shanghai, Hong Kong or Seoul unless the development quickened. So he advised that Tokyo host the World City Expo, an international exhibition, in order to accelerate the work. In so doing, Tange wanted to shorten the development term from 30 years to 10. The plan was actually set in motion, but it came to a halt after Yukio Aoshima was elected governor of Tokyo in 1995. He had called for cancellation of the Tokyo World City Expo. The plan was consequently scrapped. This led the whole idea of structuring Tokyo around the new City Hall to collapse. This slide is a photo of Roppongi Hills. The Mori Building enterprise led by Minoru Mori pursued an urban vision that was basically in line with the Arc Hills development, which took place upon enactment of the revised Urban Renewal Act in 1980. After that, the Act on Special Measures for Urban Renewal was implemented in 2002. This law was a response to the question of how to revive real estate development in the central districts of Tokyo after it had stalled in the recession caused by the collapse of Japan's bubble economy. Cases in point are the Tokyo Midtown project and development in the districts of Otemachi, Yurakucho, and Marunouchi, collectively termed Daimaru-yu. The law provided for a prompt relaxation of regulations for developers that limited the development area and could demonstrate a contribution to the public welfare through the project. This law quickly jumped real estate development in Tokyo and triggered a construction bubble. Shibuya, for example, had issues with quake-resistant performance and disaster prevention, and everyone knew these had to be resolved. But thanks to the relaxation of regulations, these issues were greatly resolved. A tower was built on top of Shibuya Station, directly linking it to the subway and various commercial facilities, while above that is a hall devoted to cultural activities. developers constructed such complexes unique to Tokyo, with floor area ratios as high as 1,300 or 1,500%, unparalleled in any other city in the world. I doubt this would have been possible without the know-how of precision construction Japan accumulated since the 1964 Olympics. I think it is over the last 20 years or so that developers drew on this know-how to transform Tokyo into a city with a high density, unlike any other city worldwide. All the development in Shibuya will reportedly be completed around 2027. This high-density subcenter of Shibuya is really unique when viewed in the context of other cities in the world. And I think the characteristics of contemporary development in Tokyo clearly appear in such areas. As a result, people began to think of the various districts of Daimaru-yu, Shibuya, Roppongi, and Shinjuku as each having their own distinctive character. At the time of the development in Shibuya, Takayuki Kishi lit a fire under the members of the Shibuya Project Committee. He asked Tokyo Corporation and the Shibuya Ward authorities what they wanted to do in Shibuya. He told them, if all you want to do is rebuild a department store, do it yourselves, you have to think more deeply than that. They eventually had the idea that Shibuya could hold its own against Marunouchi and Daimaru-yu, which are favored by good siting conditions and tradition, by emphasizing lifestyle. In short, they began to see that maybe Shibuya had culture. In the same way, Nihonbashi came to be seen as characterized by its history dating back to the Edo period, Kyobashi by craftsmanship, and Roppongi by its cosmopolitan character. As a result, even if Tokyo doesn't have a particular center, we could say its central area was reorganized with the vision of creating many different islands within a radius of about 5 kilometers. My colleagues and I call this archipelago Shimakyo, literally meaning island capital. Tokyo today is a capital consisting of islands, figuratively speaking, but it's said that Tokyo had an empty center. I'd say that there was an intensive round of further structuring for about 20 years. It seems to me that today Tokyo has lost sight of its orientation as a city. No one in today's metropolitan government is proposing to make Tokyo into a financial center for the whole Asian region, for example. Some people in Tokyo are pondering the future of Shibuya, Marunouchi, and Shinagawa, for example, but I suspect no one is talking about the future of Tokyo anymore. That concludes my review of urban development in Tokyo.
Thank you, Mr. Fujimura. By the way, the kyo in Shimakyo is the same character as kyo in Tokyo, and since the character for Shima can also be read to, Shimakyo can also be read as Tokyo. In that case, Shima would be plural and refer to the 5 islands today.
That's right. The chart in the slide is simplified and shows about 5, but there would be a few more in a more detailed chart. The islands of Nihonbashi and Marunouchi, for example, vied with each other to attract the siting of headquarters by security firms. The districts competed against each other, in other words. Then there is Kyobashi between Ginza and Nihonbashi. The Kyobashi authorities highlighted that Kyobashi was originally a district of carpenters and craftsmen, so their concept was to create a city drawing on its history. This vision of giving each district a distinctive character led to the creation of islands separated more or less by the intervals between subway stations.
You made a number of points but I was especially interested to hear about the problems involving the World City Expo. As you said, the cancellation of the Expo eliminated the prospect of another center, namely the Rinkai Tokyo Satellite Center. At the same time, Shinjuku City Center went on to lose its power. It's a story of how the Mori Building Company and other private sector players acquired more power through various development projects beginning in 2000, while the metropolitan government didn't retain enough power itself.
That's right. Development formerly led by the government came to be led by the private sector. It's as if what occurred in 19th century Paris and 20th century New York occurred together over a much shorter time in the course of Tokyo's modernization. It could be said that something like Manhattanism, which is aimed at district development by 20th century style real estate registration, is again coming to an impasse. So Tokyo may be at its next turning point.
So do you mean right now?
Yes, perhaps. But there still isn't a sense that this is actually happening. COVID-19 might play a part in accelerating change. I also have a hunch that a structural reconversion could occur. The architect Arata Isozaki calls this an evolution from city to metropolis to hypervillage. In 19th century Paris, the government built a modern city in a planned, systematic fashion, and this was followed by the emergence of big cities that typified the 20th century, based on a metropolitan model. And these days, this metropolitan model is being linked to global capitalism.
Do you have a slide for this?
Yes. Let me show a few more slides then. This evolutionary scheme is from a study published by Isozaki in 2011. His theory is that there are past patterns of urban development, exemplified by those in Paris and New York, and that we are in a transition to a new urban pattern. The Paris of the 19th century represents the case of following a plan to build a city under a government initiative and at public expense. This pattern spread throughout the world. It was followed by the metropolitan pattern born in New York in the 20th century, where private sector enterprises assume the risks of development and undertake it with funds from private sector investment. A third pattern takes this a little further and transforms cities into hypervillages. In Japanese, Isozaki terms them chotoshi, literally meaning super cities. This successive shift from city to metropolis to chotoshi began in Tokyo around the 1970s, with the transformation to a metropolis peaking around 1995. Around 2020, the next transition to the chotoshi or supercity pattern began. In Tokyo, 1995 was the last moment that governmental authorities were replaced by companies. The government held the initiative up until 1970, but its power gradually weakened and it was finally replaced by the private sector in 1995. The private sector is in a very strong position now, but I think we may see another gradual replacement over the next 25 years. The vicinities of Shibuya Station and the Daimaru-yu districts have a lot of vitality now, but I think this could be what is called the sunset effect, like the finale of a fireworks display right before the end.
So are you saying it's the private sector that is supporting the power of such hypervillages and not the government?
I think we must discern the specific direction going forward. Perhaps we'll see something like a network of economic spheres that are a little smaller. I'm picturing cities that don't take the form of metropolises, which arise due to a huge influx of people into a single center somewhere. It could be a smaller version of Shimakyo.
I asked that question because I recall two projects that never materialized, concerning an art museum and an international exhibition. One began with a design competition for the construction of a temporary museum in the Odaiba zone in 2001. The museum would have been a franchise operation of the Guggenheim, which is headquartered in New York. This was Shigeru Bun's design. This was the design in 2001. Bun's idea was for a structure with an iconic design, like those seen more in other Asian countries other than Japan. This design created quite a stir at the time. It was proposed by Jean Nouvel and could be described as either a heap of garbage or a natural hill. The hill's appearance changes along with the change of seasons. Here's another one by Zaha Hadid, which has her signature style. This project progressed quite far. I think people who belong to the generation of my seniors know about it. An informal decision had even been made about the curator, and it progressed to a certain degree. It nevertheless came to nothing. In short, the plans were underway to build a huge museum franchise owned by foreign capital in Japan. The same period saw construction of the Bilbao Guggenheim and the collapse of plans for other museums based on the franchise model in Helsinki and various other places. I find it quite significant that such a plan also advanced to a certain extent in Tokyo. I say this because of what comes to mind when we see the siting of museums and not galleries by foreign concerns in other countries, specifically Guggenheim and Louvre museums that have appeared in Dubai and other cities in the Middle East. It's a reflection of economic power and desires to establish a museum system in order to bring diversity to places with a fairly homogeneous culture. I find it intriguing that the Tokyo of those days may have been thinking along the same lines, but it came to nothing in the end. The other project concerns Arata Isozaki. It doesn't involve Tokyo, but I believe it's better known than the museum franchise plan. Here is the related article in the Yokohama Keizai Shimbun. The first Yokohama Triennale was held in 2001 in the city of Yokohama next to Tokyo. At first, there was a slightly strange setup where 4 people shared the position of director. There were all sorts of problems before the second installment. This photo was taken at the conference in 2004. They were supposed to hold the exhibition that year, but were unable to. Isozaki, who had been assigned to head it, put together a certain plan. While others in my field didn't fully understand his true intention, the plan was to forego the appointment of a curator for the second exhibition, leaving it instead to a collaboration between a fund, architects, and artists. The exhibition was also to consist of several pavilions. The fund in question could either be an established foundation or a private sector group, and the plan clearly aimed to change the basic setup of the exhibition through private sector energies. In the end, the plan didn't go ahead. Tadashi Kawamata was appointed to be the new director, and the second triennale was held in 2005, the following year. Looking at these two projects that came to nothing, I'd like to note that, as indicated by the inclusion of the word temporary in the plan, the Guggenheim franchise was going to be a temporary museum with a 10-year lifespan. In the background here, there was a movement underway to stimulate cultural activities with private sector energies and use culture to innovate cities, which included this temporary style of museum.
I think chance may have played a part in those developments, but in hindsight, I wonder if Tokyo seems like a city where intervention by global capital in the field of art is blocked.
Well, that's a possibility. Although the facts are unclear, the idea of making Tokyo into a center for the entire Asian region, as you described, raises the question of whether arrangements to accept foreign nationals as workers had been made, like in Singapore. This also applies to public administration in the field of culture. Commentators often say that Tokyo and Japan have to strengthen their ability to convey messages to the international community. But not much headway is made in terms of changing the system for the international recruitment of human resources in order to bolster these capabilities. A prime example here is the Mori Museum, the Mori Art Museum, which opened in 2003. As you know, the museum's first director was David Elliott. At the time, the appointment of a foreign national to head an art museum in Japan drew much attention. No other foreign nationals were appointed director of the museum after Elliott. Elliott was succeeded by Fumio Najo and Mami Kataoka, in that order. Both of them are internationally active, so there's no problem in that respect. But I think the reality is that the governmental authorities didn't continue with what the private sector started.
From the city development side, I think the idea of Tokyo being the center of Asia ended up being rather spurious. If we are to create a financial center for Asia, we must actually deregulate the financial sector. So in order to reform the system, the Tokyo metropolitan government cannot do it alone. It doesn't matter how hard a single city tries, Japan has to work hard as a country. Some people think that just as the national government and the Tokyo metropolitan government were about to start working together, Tange came along and pushed to speed up the process by proposing a plan to do it in 10 years, but it failed because public opinion couldn't keep up. If we'd taken due time to achieve tangible process, like deregulating the Japanese international financial system, the result might have been different. In Japan, regulations have become ever more tangled by the unique maturity of the Tokyo metropolis, leading to a situation where, for example, significant reform can't be achieved without a major event driving the change. In the case of cities, in order to accelerate this, Tange said we should speed up the process in a certain way, hence his proposal for the World City Expo. At the time, the difference between the World City Expo and the Osaka Expo was that Japan had achieved success with the Olympics and the World Expo, as did Kobe with the Kobe Port Island Exposition. The Expo concept was first developed as an idea designed to stimulate reform of the system by creating a sense of a new temporary city, while not actually building one, but then really building this into a city for visitors. Due to financial limitations, the concept was formulated first, namely the idea of showing the development itself as a World City Expo, which is unique in the world. After that, they tried to push system reform to catch up with the idea. After the IOC's presidency passed from Juan Antonio Samaranch to Jacques Roche, they have actively promoted the sense of an Olympic legacy from London, Tokyo, onto the next Paris Olympics. To this end, they are choosing cities that offer a plan to make the most of their investment, making developments that leave a legacy after the Olympics rather than just another temporal event. It seems that many have tried to achieve this kind of systemic reform, but often failed. Is there such a mode of transformation in the art world? And did Isozaki set it in motion? Or does some kind of setting come first and then change is promoted? What is the motivation here? Or what kind of scenario or power structure can stimulate a change in this situation?
In the case of Isozaki, he made that kind of proposal based on the reality that the international art scene is driven by the funding. I don't think we ever fully understood how to reflect that in the exhibition. In fact, there are various foundations, such as the Mondrian Foundation in the Netherlands and Po Helvetia in Switzerland, and various international exhibitions, also run by foundations. You could say it was just a matter of making that fact more visible, but I don't think we'd really come to the right understanding in line with global standards. On the other hand, one interesting thing about Art Week Tokyo is that it connects various art institutions in Tokyo, such as galleries, alternative spaces, and museums, both commercial and non-profit, public and private, by bus. I think the bus sounds a little old-fashioned, but that's the plan. That's where the public money is injected. I think the Agency for Cultural Affairs is funding the project with the aim of promoting Tokyo's international contemporary art image. In that sense, I think finally people realize that culture cannot be promoted without considering the economic realities. I think it's a reflected reality that Art Week Tokyo itself is therefore moving in this direction, the way we are talking it here.
I think it's the same for both cities and art. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and since the end of the 90s, capitalism has been sweeping the world. Likewise, cities are also upgrading to become global cities, capturing the movement of global money, and art has also been trying to capture a bigger market. But I feel that Tokyo missed the boat. As a result, Tokyo ended up creating many local islands, or rather unique precincts or ecosystems. That's the way it is with cities like Tokyo, and I think it's the same with art. I feel that the bus route for Are We Tokyo is designed to connect the ecosystems of art scattered throughout Tokyo. There are groups of galleries around different epicenters of art in Tokyo. In other words, it seems like the structure of art in Tokyo is developing in a unique way. Is this original compared to cities around the world? In terms of urban development, as I mentioned earlier, Tokyo doesn't have a center and is becoming more like an archipelago with various precincts. From your point of view, is there anything unique about spaces for art in Tokyo?
I feel that they're not very centralized. In New York and Berlin, galleries are concentrated in places where rents are low and land prices will rise around them. And when the rent goes up and they can't continue to run their business, they move to another location. A kind of gentrification is happening in many cities where urban redevelopment and gallery movements become integrated. But there's no such strong trend in Tokyo. It may be impolite to say so directly, but rather locations are chosen based on balance between accessibility and their rent and the degree of potential. But if the owner wants to go elsewhere, they just have to move to the next place. Before the gallery's surroundings are affected, they will move somewhere else. In other words, I think there are many cases where if the owner doesn't say anything, they just stay there. For a time, galleries were concentrated in the Johto area, such as Kiyosumi Shirakawa, but there now seems to be a return to urban centers. In Roppongi, galleries are concentrated in the Pyramide building and complex, which I assume are managed and owned by the Mori Building Company. With a little more time, I think there's a good chance it will develop into a new area for the art scene. It's the private developers that are leading the way, which is exactly what you said earlier. Mitsui Fudosan in the Nihonbashi area and Mitsubishi Estate in the Marunouchi area serve as examples of developers with this level of awareness. They own the Mitsui Memorial Museum and the Mitsubishi Ichigokan Museum, respectively, but are they trying to attract other actors, such as galleries, into the areas? I think the Mitsubishi Estate is doing its part to revitalize the Marunouchi area by running the Art Award. But as a permanent space, I wonder if it's inviting other actors into its art scene. However, the Kadan Gallery space is in the neighboring Yurakucho area.
This is some years ago now, but in 1975, the Sezon Museum of Art, which was later renamed, opened in Ikebukuro as the Seiwo Museum of Art. Seiji Tsutsumi, a strong character, led the scene until the Sezon Museum closed in 1999. In addition, the Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo was built in 1995 as a public investment, and Mori Art Museum was built in 2003. Recent developments seek to make a public contribution, so cultural spaces are located on floors with easy access. For example, a building in Shibuya has been designed to have an open space for the public. It's creating a sort of wave as an alternative space, but I think there were two major forces in each area: the private sector, which includes the charismatic Seiji Tsutsumi and Minoru Mori, and the public sector, such as the Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo. Then there were also the small galleries that responded to them. For example, in the 80s, there were the Sagacho exhibit space and Sai the bathhouse. Recently, we've seen a vibrant landscape with art galleries in the Kiyosumi Shirakawa area. Is that similar to movements overseas? Or what do you think about ambitious spaces like the Serpentine Gallery or Palais de Tokyo? Are there any similar intermediary spaces in Tokyo?
Well, I think the discussion is probably moving on to the future prospects after 2021. Palais de Tokyo, just mentioned, is open until midnight. It's not in the heart of Paris, but it is easily accessed. And it's on a hill with a great view. It's a place where young people can go in the evening for tea or drinks. And you can also relax in a comfortable space created by Lacaton and Vassal, free of charge. An art space that showcases ambitious exhibition content and is open until midnight is, as they say, a very important way to show the city's vitality. Moreover, about half of the funds for Palais de Tokyo come from the government and the city, and the other half from donations and admission revenue. So it is, in fact, a public institution of sorts. The Serpentine Gallery in London is a fairly dynamic institution that spends about $1 to $2 million a year to create a summer pavilion. There should be a comparable institution or program in Tokyo, but it hasn't been possible so far. This year, Pavilion Tokyo 2021 was held with the support from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government in conjunction with the Olympic Games. But if it became a regular event, it might look different. Earlier, Mr. Fujimura used the term epicenter. Amidst the pandemic, our lifestyle has changed to various degrees. But I think the situation won't change unless we create a kind of epicenter of cultural facilities fitting the lifestyles of many people. At first, Mori Art Museum was open until midnight, but its hours have been gradually shrinking. It's understandable since it's run by the private sector. In the private sector, changes are natural when it's difficult to be profitable. I think there is a possibility for the public to do this and create such spaces for the long term. In the case of Palais de Tokyo, the director was decided about 3 years before it opened. Nicolas Bouriard was the first director, and it's very characteristic that a director was in charge of setting the direction of the institution. Sounds like I'm asking for the impossible, but I believe that a facility with a long-term vision is absolutely necessary.
I see. If such a space is government-led, the maintenance would be dealt with publicly, and if it had been private sector-led, it might have been possible to make the transition in a kind of community-minded manner. What will the age of the hypervillage be like? What kind of places can be realized? With what kind of funding? I think we have to imagine the future in many ways. Perhaps a university like Tokyo University of the Arts could do more. There are some spaces. Alternatively, there's an art space like Bank Art in Yokohama and other prefectural and municipal museums in other prefectures. Perhaps those places outside of Tokyo would have potential to create new movements. Do you have any predictions about what the area of hypervillages will be like?
Various people are participating in culture by creating a collection, so to speak, but I also think it would be better to show examples of how people can join in ways other than this. I'll refrain from naming individuals, though. For example, in Berlin, there's an exhibition space in a renovated air raid shelter, which is, I think, called Bunker, for private collectors. In LA, Eli Broad built a big museum called The Broad. There are many ways to contribute by getting private collections involved when we look outside of Japan. It would be exciting to see something of that scale happen in Tokyo, but then such a scale may be impractical. It is true that various people are starting different things, albeit on a small scale. For example, a space called ANB Tokyo opened in Roppongi recently. ANB Tokyo is supported by an entrepreneur who is a philanthropic supporter of contemporary art. I feel if we have more of these spaces, things will change. However, I think we need to consider whether it's really a good idea to develop in just one location or not. This is a little bit off topic, but there's an art event called Manifesta that travels around Europe and is held every 2 years in various cities. Last year it was held in Marseille, before that in Palermo, Sicily, and before that in Zurich. It's similar to the Olympic Games, but a little bit different from the EU Capital of Culture, because there's an organization called Manifesta that selects these cities from candidate cities. Having an exhibition in that city increases its cultural presence. In Palermo, an architectural design firm called OMA participated. Before deciding on the exhibition theme, OMA came in and surveyed the city, and the director and curatorial team decided the theme based on that research. In Marseille, I believe MVRDV participated. Recently, there's a kind of collaboration between architectural and curatorial teams, instead of deciding a theme based only on the curator's thoughts. When working with a city for an event, there's now a team that can do proper architectural research. That's where I feel there's a certain potential. After Manifesto is over, if you really want to do it again, you can start a new biennale or triennale. An organization with skills comes in, does all sorts of research, the curator plans and exhibits the exhibition, and then leaves. I think it's also suggestive of how to continue with what remains.
What's interesting about the relationship between cities and art these days is that the temporary and transient nature of art is being employed as a kind of experimental ground for urban development. The way of designing cities is changing because the idea of predicting what will happen 50 years from now and investing towards that is no longer effective. So we have to design cities by trying various things and gradually developing a vision. So when, for example, we do a social experiment like let's build a plaza here and see how people spend their time, we do something that replicates an art festival. I think there's quite a lot of overlap between such cultural efforts and urban construction efforts. In the Netherlands, when they decided to develop a subway, they boldly built something like an artist village first. The artists were the first to enter the community and create a kind of commune. Only after communicating with the residents in various ways would a discussion on the development be considered. I think that's the kind of political nature that art has. But when it comes to development, there's a right-wrong dichotomy which divides the community sometimes. This is where art, which can be both for and against, can enter first and create a new situation, and then development can begin. In Japan, I think the relocation of Kyoto City University of Arts is one example where art was first to engage in community issues. If you explore the history, you may find that this was the reason why Tokyo University of the Arts moved to Ueno in the first place. In this way, I think history is sometimes made when art is incorporated into a phase of urban change. I think that if art becomes integral to the current phase of change in Tokyo, it will recreate a sense of dynamism.
Tokyo, on the other hand, even in Nishikasai and Kita Ward, many places are becoming more and more multicultural. A Chinatown has been established outside of Ikebukuro. In the midst of all the so-called ethnic sensations, I wonder if it's okay for culture and art not to enter into such places. Maybe it's hard for commercial spaces to be involved, but it's also important for public spaces to make their place. The Netherlands is also integrating art for inclusion of diversity in various ways. I think with the Dutch system, even without Dutch citizenship, you could receive public support if you were an artist and had a certain level of career. What you just said reminded me of something. I once went to Tensta Konsthall in Tensta, Sweden. They don't have a collection because it's a Konsthall. But I was there because the artist Masato Kobayashi was having an exhibition there. It was like the last stop on the subway line, and the moment I got off the train, there was an apartment block area, and I felt like I might simply have come to a bad place. But there was a rather pompous facility there, either on the ground floor of an apartment block or a cultural facility in an apartment block district. That's where Masato Kobayashi was exhibiting his painting installation. Kobayashi was living in Belgium at the time, and the fact that a Japanese artist living in Belgium was having an exhibition in the suburbs of Sweden, in an area where many people live, has its own significance. Incidentally, the director at the time was Maria Lind, who is now an influential figure in the contemporary art world. She was then at the beginning of her career. In a way, I think the bus running during Art Week Tokyo visits various art spots once developed and revitalized by the private sector. There are also artists who are trying to interact with the city in various ways, such as Shibu House, who open up their living space. I think the organizers of this event, including the Agency for Cultural Affairs, since public money is involved, need to discover the real potential of Tokyo and propose new movements necessary for the future, including such situations. I hear that Art Week Tokyo is positioned as a pre-event this year. The full launch will be next year. I think it would be great if we could use these discussions as a starting point to further discuss and propose what kind of art events should be held in Tokyo next year and beyond. Mr. Fujimura, if you have any last words, please.
Well, Tokyo is a unique place, both as a city and for its art. And we often hear arguments about how inferior it is compared to other global cities. It's often said that the Japan art market differs from global art trends. But I think that might be one positive characteristic. As the world moves towards the urban structure of the hypervillage, I think perhaps this archipelago ecosystem of Tokyo could become an indicator of the next structure, or could even be totally reinterpreted. Perhaps this bus tour is born from Tokyo's particular structure as a kind of hypervillage. Or perhaps it is necessarily a circular form, and if we read it that way, I have a feeling it will lead to the next step, and we can enjoy Art Week Tokyo even more.
Thank you very
あり
much.
がとうございます。
保坂さん。
Thank you very much, Mr. Hosaka and Mr. Fujimura. Thank you all for watching. For the latest information on Art Week Tokyo and details of upcoming talks, please check the website.
東京の最新情報および今後のトークの詳細はホームページからぜひ確認してください。
The link is available in the description box.
リンクが記載されていますので、ぜひそちらをチェックしてみてください。
Bus tickets can also be purchased from the same website. Passes range from 1-day to 4-day passes, and even pair passes are available. Please follow us on our SNS too. Finally, the next talk will be given by Mami Kataoka, Director of Mori Art Museum, on art in transition, where and by whom should art be evaluated. Please look forward to it too. Thank you for joining us
あり
today.
がとうございました。
ありがとうございました。